Okay, welcome to Veterans for Gun Sense, hosted by the Everytown Veteran Advisory Council. I'm your moderator, Chris Marvin. I'm the principal of Marvin Strategies, and I serve as the Veteran Engagement Lead for Everytown for Gun Safety and Moms Demand Action. Today's meeting is entitled Playing Army, Military Fetishism, White Supremacy, and the Proliferation of Guns. There is a lot to talk about here, historically, in recent events, and looking towards the future. We're going to try to keep the conversation focused on a few specific themes, which I'll outline in a moment. To help us weed through much of this content, we'll be joined by a group of amazing leaders in this area. First, we're going to speak with Marine Corps veteran and award-winning author Phil Klay, whose new book, Missionaries, was released 1 week ago today. The interview with Phil will be followed by a panel that will allow us to dive deeper into tonight's topic of military fetishism. On that panel will be Army Lieutenant Colonel retired Jason Dempsey, Army veteran Justin McFarland, and Managing Director at Center for American Progress, Katrina Mulligan. Veterans for Gun Sense is a virtual forum made up primarily of military veterans that discusses and takes action on the nation's gun violence prevention priorities. This forum is hosted by the Everytown Veteran Advisory Council, which is a small group of veterans from diverse backgrounds, all of whom are a small group of volunteers from diverse backgrounds, all of whom are military veterans. We advise Everytown for gun safety and Moms Demand Action on veteran-related content and strategy. The council is organized around what we've described as the 3 pillars of military gun culture, and these are training, safety, and accountability. Our efforts aim to incorporate more training, safety, and especially accountability into our nation's gun laws as a way to emulate military gun culture and reduce gun violence in America. Today's topic falls directly at the intersection of gun violence prevention and veteran interests. Gun ownership in America is on the rise during the pandemic, which is currently overwhelming our nation's background check system. In recent months, we've increasingly seen the presence of guns at protests and other civil actions, sometimes leading to violence and fatalities. More and more, the carrying of firearms in protests or as a display of power occurs as part of organized efforts by groups that follow various ideologies, including white supremacy, racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-government sentiment, as well as, for some groups, the desire for societal collapse and the start of a second civil war. In many instances, the participants not only carry military-style weaponry, but also dress the part, wearing battle dress uniforms, combat boots, military load-carrying equipment, and in some cases, body armor. As a result, the differences between armed, uniformed civilian militia members and the actual military or law enforcement can be so small as to be virtually indistinguishable to the average citizen. A lot's been written on this phenomenon lately and on related topics in the recent months. I can tell you that from the research I did in preparation for this forum, that the complex layers and intersecting interests can be dizzying at times, as can the numerous sources of information. As a jumping off point, I want to highlight 2 recent reports from Everytown Research that have spurred multiple conversations amongst our Veteran Advisory Council. In June, the team put out a fact sheet entitled Armed COVID-19 Protests Exploit Open Carry Loopholes. This report explores the lack of laws around the open carry of firearms, which has allowed hundreds of people with assault weapons and other firearms onto city streets, into public protests, and even inside state capitol buildings. More recently, Everytown released Armed and Dangerous: How the Gun Lobby Enshrines Guns as Tools of the Extreme Right. This report explains the NRA's role in promoting and enabling violent extremism domestically. When we consider these 2 reports together, we see the dangerous cocktail that's created when guns are allowed to be carried anywhere at any time, combined with the increased prevalence of groups and individuals with nefarious objectives. They want to exploit loopholes in the law that allow them to obtain and carry firearms as a way to achieve their own goals. To be clear, I'm talking about the kinds of people who belong to organizations promoting white supremacy, the violent overthrow of the government, or the beginning of an American Civil War. We saw a firsthand example of this just last week, when the FBI foiled a plot by members of an anti-government militia group in Michigan who intended to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer. This summer, we had an incident in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where a 17-year-old male with an AR-15 who wasn't part of a militia, but was answering the call that militias had put out to protect private property from protesters, killed 2 people and wounded another. We're also all likely familiar with the scenes that played out in Portland when racial justice protesters and armed counter-protesters clashed, or the armed protesters at the Michigan State House complaining about pandemic-driven stay-at-home orders, or the huge groups of pro-gun protesters earlier this year in Richmond, voicing displeasure with newly elected gun violence prevention laws in the state, or perhaps most infamously, the neo-Nazi-led rally in Charlottesville in 2017. The history of anti-government militias has strong ties to the 1992 Ruby Ridge standoff in Idaho and the siege of the Branch Davidians compound in Waco in 1993, with both events leading extremists to organize anti-government militia groups in the aftermath. Then in 1995, anti-government rhetoric neared its peak when a federal building in Oklahoma City was bombed. The perpetrator, Timothy McVeigh, had extreme anti-government views and ties to militia groups in Michigan. All of these incidents and the topics surrounding them are complex. They deserve time and study and thought, and unfortunately, we don't have the space to unpack everything here tonight. Likewise, different armed groups, protesters, militias, and the like have vastly different principles and motivations. We cannot, and tonight we will do our best not to, generalize around the underlying beliefs of anyone who is holding a gun in public. Here's what we will focus on tonight. There are people in our country who want to do harm to certain other groups of people, who want to destroy the government, and who want to demonstrate the power of their own objectives and ideologies. Most of these actors are well outside the mainstream and beyond the pale of any political ideals that are reasonable for most Americans. Yet, these same people have virtually unfettered access to firearms, including military-style assault weapons. And they take advantage of loopholes that allow them to carry these weapons in public, use them to threaten free speech, and in some cases, commit violence against others. Tonight's conversation will look at these issues through the eyes of military veterans, those of us who were taught to prioritize training, safety, and accountability for our weapons and for the weapons of those around us. We'll probably poke fun at some of the military cosplay that goes on around the country. We'll express some level of indignation of how these people denigrate our military service. And we will most certainly focus on the danger that military fetishism, extremist groups, and the proliferation of guns plays in our society. But before we jump into all of that conversation, I want to bring in our first guest for this evening. Phil Klay is a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. His short story collection, Redeployment, won the 2014 National Book Award for Fiction and the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize for Best Debut Work in Any Genre. It was also selected as one of the 10 best books of 2014 by the New York Times. His nonfiction work won the George W. Hunt Prize for Journalism, Arts, and Letters in the category of Cultural and Historical Criticism in 2018. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, all the other places I'd like to publish, and the Brookings Institution Brookings Essay Series. He's on the board of Arts in the Armed Forces, and he currently teaches fiction at Fairfield University. His debut novel, Missionaries, was released on October 6th. Phil, welcome to Veterans for Gun Sense.
Thank you so much for having me.
Phil, I know I laid out some really heavy thoughts right off the top, and that was intentional.
Sure.
I don't intend to drop all of them back on you to start. So I'd actually like to begin with your new book, and we'll segue back into military fetishism in a moment. Missionaries is your second book, and it's your debut novel. So I'd like you to just tell everybody a little bit about this project, which has many, many years in the making, and how your first week of post-release has gone for you.
It's been good. That's the book. And I guess in terms of what we're talking about today, maybe there is an aspect of it that is maybe useful to highlight. So it's me trying to find a way to put into a novel something about the way that war works in the 21st century. And I think one of the things that we have sort of seen abroad is a kind of blurring between sort of war and crime, right? In sort of various theaters of conflict. We've also seen the development of a highly sophisticated sort of US military apparatus for kill capture, right? For finding people and taking them out. One of the characters in the novel is a special forces medic. And we sort of see how the special forces, which initially had been conceived of as a group, sort of kind of warrior diplomats, institution building sort of branch of a unit within the military, in Afghanistan in particular became increasingly used just for like direct action missions, right? I was talking to one special forces guy, said, we go into the same valleys year after year, and we wouldn't be bringing, money for roads or building up the government or education or anything like that. We would just be doing interdiction mission after interdiction mission, getting into these gnarly firefights against, basically like relatively young kids the Taliban was sending against us to get chewed up. And it got fairly bleak, right? And I think one of the things that is a concern of mine is if you look at the kind of intellectual lessons that in theory we should have learned from the past 2 decades of wars, we should have learned about the limits of what you can do purely with violence, right? And the limits in terms of achieving political ends and political stability with simply by recourse to the use of violence. And yet, if you look at what we've built a highly efficient apparatus for extending violent power in the world, and we have allowed other organs of U.S. power, just look at what has happened to the State Department, to wither. And at the same time, we've seen a kind of odd type of political rhetoric. So in the wake, and also sort of in pop culture, so in the wake of wars that have not been successful, that have not had clear beginning, middles, and ends, where we've had sort of periods of seeming success followed by disaster. We've had surges to area where we've achieved some degree of relative calm, only to leave and have those areas return to controlled by insurgent groups. In the pop culture and in politics, one thing that's become extremely popular is special operations raids, right? So, the Osama bin Laden raid, depictions of special operators, Navy SEAL memoirs, and also in terms of politics, bragging about killing somebody is something that a leader can do in lieu of actually having a strategy. So the last State of the Union address, Barack Obama essentially said, if you think I'm not serious about fighting terrorism, ask Osama bin Laden, ask the head of the, the guy who planned the Benghazi attack, right? Because we had gotten those guys. And Donald Trump made a similar sort of case in the RNC, right? Look at what I did with Qasem Soleimani. Now, in both cases, their military policy is somewhat dubious. And certainly in the case of the Qasem Soleimani raid, it's not as though Iranian-backed militias have sort of been less active in Iraq in the wake of that. In fact, it seems they've been emboldened. But there is a sort of attempt to, in lieu of approaching hard problems, right, and achieving sort of stable political outcomes, especially overseas, is a very hard problem. There's a recourse to violence, right? Well, there's one thing that we can do. We can kill somebody. And in the novel, there's a sort of raid in the middle of the novel. It's based on a real thing that happened in Colombia. And we helped the Colombians do targeted assassinations starting in the mid-2000s. Using sort of techniques and technology and that we did sort of radically expanded in Iraq. There's a raid that's based on a real raid where this drug dealer or narco trafficker ordered a 6-foot-tall teddy bear for his girlfriend, and the Colombian military put a beacon inside the teddy bear so they could track it to his finca out in this area called Norte de Santander, and then they went in and killed him. And whereas that is a kind of like a story that we often see in pop culture, right? Like there's a bad guy, there's some, well-trained soldiers who prepare for the raid. They go in, they take the guy out, and then they go home and celebrate. The novel is concerned with the things that lead up to that raid, and then the consequences in the region, right? How that changes things in the area, how the power structure changes. In relationship to that raid and what those sort of broader consequences are. And it sort of brings 2 American and 2 Colombian characters and their kind of plots intersect in this region of Norte de Santander, though, some of the characters, one character starts out in Iraq, one character starts out in Afghanistan. And I think in in relationship to what you've been talking about, that sort of narrow view of the use of violent force, right? And having the sort of satisfying use of violent force as being held up as an option in lieu of the hard work of politics, really, um, uh, in terms of looking at communities and what they need and what they want, what their desires are, what they're lacking, and what are, what isn't sort of creating discontent or unrest, and instead trying to substitute, what seems like an easy solution, which would be violence.
So I think that's a perfect segue, because you've taken us to the Middle East, where you served, and then you described Colombia, where the book is set. And of course, the book is set in a country that has been involved with a decades-long conflict between government and FARC guerrillas. Colombia has seen corruption in government, military, and police, in addition to armed extremist groups on both the left and the right. Colombia is, more or less an armed society, and citizens too often pay the price for that.
Right.
And as we know, you've spent a ton of time thinking about this, but you're also a combat veteran. And so you've seen armed conflict and studied it in other parts of the world as well. So as you walk us through that solution of violence, as sort of you put it, I'm wondering about your thoughts on what's happening now in the United States with armed protesters, militias, and the general arming of America, and how that compares to what you've seen, studied, and written about.
Right. So I think that I should not. I'd never been in combat. I was trying, make that clear. I find it extremely disturbing, right? And it goes along with that line of sort of substituting violence for the hard work of politics, right? I was interviewing a Colombian colonel. We're in the lead up to the peace deal, and I was talking about sort of things that types of US aid that he thought were most important for continuing post-peace treaty, because everybody expected that there would be continuing violence in the aftermath of the peace treaty. And he mainly talked about our support for their helicopters, essentially, right? But I, tried to push him to get other things, because at that time, if you talk to some people in the Obama administration, they would really harp on targeted killing as being an important thing, because we'd helped the Colombians with it, and now they were heading to this peace treaty. And I wondered if he was going to bring that up as being a critical component or something that he thought was really important. And he didn't. One thing that he said was, the human rights stuff, you should keep up with that. Which at first, when he said that, I thought he was, I thought he knew I was an American, and he would say human rights, and my heart would melt. Though at the same time, he'd already talked to me about working with the paramilitaries. He talked to me about, he'd gone to the School of the Americas in the 1980s, and all of his instructors were Vietnam vets who, even for this guy, he was like, sus tácticos un poquito agresivo, they'd taught him about free fire zones, all this stuff. He didn't strike me as the sort to say human rights, but it became clear as he kept talking that it was purely out of pragmatics. He essentially said, the peace treaty goes through, we're going to be responsible for areas that where we've done a lot of massacres. The Army has massacred civilians. And if we keep doing that, it's going to cause problems for us in the long term. And I think about that in a variety of ways in relation to the current situation. When for example, the Trump administration sent, paramilitary law enforcement groups to Portland, the response, predictably, was an intensification, right, of kind of protest and unrest. If you have a kid who arms himself with a gun and goes into another city to ostensibly kind of protect property, it's the sort of outcome of several people shooting at each other is not that unpredictable. I think that there's a way in which the temperature keeps getting turned up on in our sort of modern political life, and violence is this kind of perennial solution. It's part of the American mythology, right? I mean, in ways that are actually not really historically true, or in part sort of a result of firearms marketing from the 19th century. you'd have like Sam Colt essentially couldn't make it as a firearms manufacturer because there wasn't enough of a market for his weapons, right? Americans didn't buy that many guns. He'd sold 10,000 guns to Texas, and that saturated the market, which is kind of amazing to think about, 10,000 guns saturating the market in Texas. And instead started sort of figuring out how to aggressively build a civilian market by essentially sort of blending sort of civilian and military ideals. He suggested that his firearms would keep you safe in dangerous communities. He called one of his weapons the Peacemaker. He at one point wrote to Brigham Young, the leader of the Mormons, and suggested that like Colts would defend against hordes of savages and white marauders. And over time, sort of like predicament advertising became this huge thing within the gun industry in an attempt deliberately to grow a civilian market. Winchester did the same thing and actually deliberately sort of would avoid large orders of guns in the attempt to, quote, scatter our guns around, right, to try and get them into as many civilian hands as possible, because even in the mid 1800s, not that many people had firearms, right? Theoretically, the Winchester is the gun that won the West, but they sold 10 times as many Winchesters, after World War I than they had, at any point during kind of westward expansion. And so there are these like ideas that have been baked into the American sense of ourselves, right? Of like achieving order through a gun, right? After the Civil War, it was Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, but Samuel Colt made them equal, right? And I think in recent times, that kind of ideology, which was created to grow a civilian market, right? And to make people think that this was not just a kind of useful tool, but actually like the way you achieve the American ideals, right? Of like freedom and democracy, because you have a gun, so you can go anywhere you want and all men must respect you. That feels like it has gone in hyperdrive, right? In the past couple decades.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. Because you talk about 10,000 guns saturating the Texas market, and here we are, well over 300 million guns in the country now. More than one for every man, woman, and child. And
right, there was a spike in guns during the sort of crime waves, right, which sort of you can understand, and you had a pretty irresponsible kind of NRA advertising during that time. But then sort of gun sales fell to about, I think, around like 3 million a year, 3 to 5 million a year firearms sold in America in the kind of late 90s. And then just gun sales spiked with Barack Obama in the current era of the pandemic. I think we had like 2 million firearm sales in August alone. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that at the top, that there's such a spike because of this pandemic and many other things politically and otherwise going on. We of course here are trying to use the voice of veterans for gun violence prevention. We talk about training and accountability all the time. When I was thinking about who I wanted to invite to be the guest for our final Veterans for Gun Sense session before the election, I wanted someone who understood what I refer to as the veteran voice. Now, I'll admit that I've received pushback from veterans that phrase may not work very well for them, because veterans don't all speak with one voice, and I think that's certainly true. We're one of the most diverse population subsets that you can find, and that includes our ideologies and our personal beliefs. But when I think about the veteran voice, I think it's something in the credibility behind our statements, right? So for example, we come from a profession of arms, so our opinions on guns are often rightly trusted. And I think about you and your first book, Redeployment, which I devoured immediately and still love to this day. You explore the veteran voice and the military voice in a way that I think few have from our generation. And in doing so, I know that you spoke to many of us as veterans. But I'd like you to talk about what it means both to have the responsibility to speak as a veteran, using that veteran voice, but also sometimes the burden that might come with speaking for a generation of veterans.
Yeah, I try not to think of myself as speaking for vets. for precisely the reason you mentioned, because it's such a diverse group, I do think that there's a place that the veteran holds in our culture, right? Kind of schizophrenic place. So there's kind of like the veteran is kind of the broken individual sort of idea that you sometimes encounter. But then you also have this kind of like fetishizing of the veteran, and the veteran as kind of like the ultimate American, the truest of American. It's an idea that you'll sometimes see from articulated by vets themselves, right? So during the George Floyd protests, when there was a lot of coverage of sort of looting, especially on sort of right-wing news channels, I think it was Rob O'Neill was putting things about how, something like, I can't believe that I, put my life on the line to defend you folks. And that kind of idea of like, I am the, I am the true great American, and you sort of civilians, will never quite live up to my example and probably aren't worthy of my sacrifice is I think something that you sometimes see. And it's a function of this sort of like iconic symbolic status that veterans have taken on, the way that they become this kind of sacred cow in our politics, and also just defamiliarization, right? Because there's so few of us out there. We're such a small portion of the population that it's easier for people to, who want to grab the microphone and pretend that they speak for veterans to do so, and to kind of try and lord it over their fellow citizens. It's a, it's a peculiar, sometimes comical thing, but you see it everywhere, and I think it's actually really toxic to not just our democracy, because veterans are not supposed to be the ultimate arbiter of the kind of ultimate citizens, but merely a different type of citizen, and merely different type of service. But also because I think it's toxic for veterans themselves, right? For whom sort of this kind of sense of isolation as a separate warrior caste is unhealthy. I would say, though, in terms of the responsibility, then part of your responsibility is to open a space for civilians to join in those conversations about these topics. And then also, I think that, not to sort of use to respect the respect that American citizens give to you, right? When you speak in public as a veteran, sort of being aware of what you can talk about, what kind of expertise you really do have, what you really do have personal experience with, and how that might be leveraged to further understanding, right, among the broader populace, versus sort of pontificating at the broader populace.
I think that's right. I think that we often talk about the idea that veterans enjoy an implicit bias. And a lot of times there's conversations about implicit bias and how negative it can be. I've often said, that I actually don't enjoy that implicit bias as a veteran, but if you're going to put me on a pedestal while I'm up here, let me talk to you about gun violence prevention, right? So like taking those opportunities. I also think, though, that when you talk about that sacred cow, right, and that space that veterans occupy, and the idea that we're sometimes deified in society, getting back very specific to the topic of this evening, I can't help but think that it has something to do with the proliferation of military fetishism and militias, sure, and all of this. And then, of course, it becomes very directly related to gun laws and white supremacy and violence, right? And so we're going to have, in a few moments, after we do some Q&A, we're going to have 3 experts come on to talk very specifically about a lot of those things. And I wanted to give you the first word. You probably already had the first word, but I'll give you another word on those issues. But specifically, then, just tying it all together, is like how we see, how you see these topics, the topic of military fetishism uniquely as a veteran.
Yeah. I think that it's especially in the current era where it gets tied up with, these groups responding to sort of widespread protest, right? And there is a way in which, if you sort of look overseas and you see a kind of discomforting blending of dealing with sort of enemy combatants in war and dealing with crime, right? And it not being always perfectly clear that it's possible to disentangle the two, or that we're sort of doing what we ought to try and disentangle the two where we can. You also see that creeping into American perceptions of our fellow citizens, right? The sense that there is a kind of, enemy who must be fought and met with force. There's almost when there was sort of violence, there was almost a kind of excitement among particular types of media figures, right? Political and political operatives, because of the sense that this was useful, right? This was part of a narrative in which we could sort of just kind of perfectly blend the military that sort of like excitement that we get from sort of military action and deploy it against, sort of internal enemies, right? Which I find really toxic. And of course, you've seen this out of similar militarization of police and some kind of more disturbing police training videos or things shared by some of the more toxic police unions, where it's very clear that, they're describing the area that police officers are going through as if it's a battlefield, right? And that sensibility is extremely dangerous. And also, if you claim to care about law and order, it's the last thing that is likely to result in any kind of civic peace.
I also think that if you spent time in some certain battlefields, it seems a little bit ridiculous.
It does seem ridiculous, but then there are people cheering it on who have served time in various battlefields, and so I think that is one area where there have been some veteran voices who've been particularly bad in that regard, and that's one area where I think the veterans, with something of hopefully a more level head, do have a responsibility to speak up.
So we're going to go to questions now. I have one. Phil, this is from John, and it says, what is the best way for us as vets to disentangle the culture of guns being equated with freedom? How could we replace it with the concept of healthy civic debate? And then he says, especially where he is in Virginia Beach, where they're all still steeped in the ethos of Navy SEALs and naval aviation.
Yeah. I mean, I think, participating in this, guns, the idea that, one of the things just being in the military, like, you don't associate guns with freedom. It's like a responsibility and a pain in the ass chore half the time, I suppose, because everybody has them. But
can you imagine being in that basement room somewhere, like cleaning M4, your M16, and someone's like, isn't this the best part of freedom? I'm like, no, I can't.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the thing about, like, if you were in Iraq in 2007, right? The degree of security that you felt had everything, at various different points, had everything to do with whether the local tribes in the region that you were had decided to ally with the Americans or not, right? James Madison, said all government rests on opinion, right? It doesn't, power comes out of the barrel of the gun is not something that an American political leader said, right? We are, in theory, a nation founded on the idea that freedom and political power emerges from people working in concert, right? Fellow citizens working in concert, right? That doesn't mean there's no role for you know, armed agents of the state or anything like that. But that freedom is not, hiding behind a gun ready to shoot at anybody who shoots at you. If you're in a position where you need to constantly fear for your life, you're not free in the first place, right? So, with all the weaponry that we had, what Marine infantry felt, free on patrol in Ramadi in 2006, they didn't, right? You probably felt a lot freer back home, surrounded by a community that you knew and understood and had faith and trust in.
Scott's asking, what is one thing that you wish mainstream news media did differently about how they cover military and veteran issues?
I think it's hard because, there is war weariness among the public. So people who really put in work, it's sometimes difficult to get it out there, right? A lot of people don't want to think about the wars, don't want to think about military and veteran issues. There is a certain degree of sensationalizing. I'm not a big fan of the, I once saw, not to pick on the guy, but he's the first one that comes to mind, Rob O'Neill, like brought on Fox News, and they're like, so what do you think about Donald Trump's negotiations with North Korea? He's like, well, let me tell you the thing. I was like, dude, you were a commando. Like, what do you know about diplomacy, right? So I think there's a kind of almost like gullibility that we see, right. And it can happen in various different ways. And Fox News is not the only network that has played into this. I once wrote a piece about Eric Greitens and the way that he kind of leveraged his identity as a SEAL, despite having never served in teams, in kind of various different like arenas of American life, where he was kind of constantly leaning on the particular mystique that had. So I think a certain degree of skepticism about that, a little less kid gloves, but also I think more care around the issue of like, a lot of networks and organizations have actually become very good about this around issues of like mental health and things like that. Because that's something that I've often found. But honestly, there are some really great journalists out there, and the biggest problem to me is not, and I say this as the New York Times at war just announced that they were shutting down soon. It's not that the coverage isn't necessarily so bad, it's that people aren't necessarily interested in it anymore. And how do you solve that problem? How do you get people to continue to care about these issues?
Well, so let me give you a question that actually I think kind of presents a double-edged sword with
right.
regard to people both caring about the military and military stories and also like this reverence and asking, a Navy SEAL about, diplomatic matters, right? So, and it's something I've thought a lot about, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. So Matt asks, what role or responsibility does Hollywood have to create content that shows the real cost of war and not just the hero porn, as he calls it, but also acknowledging the value of that, aforementioned hero porn, because movies like Red Dawn and Black Hawk Down are the ones that inspired our generation to join the military. And as a former Black Hawk helicopter pilot, I can't deny that.
Right.
It was the book for me, not the movie, but nonetheless.
Oh, fancy! I saw the movie first.
The
Classic guy.
I was already in flight school when the movie came out, so I couldn't tell you that inspired me. I was already a Fort Rucker, but I'd read the book.
Yeah, like I don't think that a good war sort of depiction of the military necessarily needs to be some sort of like strident anti-war thing, and I'm kind of skeptical about whether those kinds of films are even as anti-war as they think. I mean, Marines love Full Metal Jacket, you know? I mean, that movie has sent more Marines to the recruiter than probably any piece of straight up military advertising that's ever been made.
And Top Gun for naval aviation for sure, right?
Yeah.
It's the volleyball scene that people like the most.
Well, you know, who wouldn't? But we were going to recreate that for this Zoom call, but then decided against it. I think that Hollywood has a responsibility. I think there's a certain degree of emphasis on precisely those things that I think are all over the culture, which is, you know, kind of the story that is leading to the, like, and it's a classic story structure. So this is why, you know, the neat, clean parable of killing a bad guy and going home, right? And I would just wish that our narratives would complicate that more than they do, right? And take in at least a little bit of what we, you know, come to understand about, you know, the nature of war and the limitations of that. I understand why it's a nice, neat story to sort of focus on the special operator. But then at the same time, you know, movies that have tried to tell more complicated stories, they're not going to be as popular, right? So I think it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge to find sophisticated and yet appealing ways of telling people the truth. This is something that I struggle with as a fiction writer myself, and I think you have more space to do it in novels.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I will say, and I've done done work in Hollywood and in this space, and you know, I do think that there was a time with some of the films that came out, however good or bad they were about the post 9/11 generation. That, you know, Lone Survivor being one of them, that was the first time people even got a chance to look at what it might be like to be in combat in Afghanistan, the longest war in the history of our country, and people couldn't name one battle from that war. And then maybe after that they can at least say, well, there's that Lone Survivor thing. So there is an educational component, even if it's not inspirational or or war porn or whatever we want to call it. But there's something to having these conversations. And so I want to end with one more question from Tyler, who's a high school English teacher. So we'll get right back into your area of expertise here, Phil. He's teaching American Lit this year. He is one of few veterans that his students know or interact with. And he's talking about conflict literature. So he wants to know what your thoughts are on teaching war lit and then balancing that understanding, understanding the experience and telling enough of the horrors of war to try to cause students to maybe shy away from war, he says, or the idolatization of service members. Talking about, like, you know, making sure that they understand this, right, without going down a path of military fetishism.
I think that the best you can do is expose them to really good stuff.
Yeah, he's also asked for book tips. That was the last thing in his book tips for the unit are always appreciated, he says.
Yeah. You know, I think actually when I talk about military fetishism, where is it? Matt Gallagher's Empire City is actually really, really good on that, and has a kind of like it's like an alternate reality America, veterans with superpowers thing. So it's sort of perfect in terms of that regard. I would say that, you know, the most honest and challenging war lit, you know, is not necessarily going to give the kids a didactic message about whether they should or should not go into service, but it will confront them with the kinds of moral questions and crises that experience of violence brings people to. And so I think that's the best you can do and hope for. Before I went into the Marines, I had a professor in college, the poet Tom Slay, a wonderful poet who knew I was joining the Marines. So he had me read Isaac Babel's Red Cavalry, had me read Tolstoy's War and Peace, Hemingway's Stories, Journey to the End of the Night by Celine, just David Jones and Princess, just a bunch of the greatest things, some of the greatest minds to write about war. And so, yeah, expose them to that stuff. Company K might be an interesting one for high school students, because there are all these little short snippets, the Great World War I novel that most people don't think about. But that's, yeah, I bet high school students would like Company K. But, I think, there's like the desire to like mold people in a particular direction. But the thing about art is that good art doesn't do that, right? Good art just exposes people to new ways of seeing the world, right? Which is valuable in and of itself. And then they, go on and make decisions. I've had people ready redeployment told me they joined the military after that, right?
I was going to jump in and suggest the Redeployment could be a good book for that unit.
Yeah.
Of course, missionaries could as well. And somebody actually jumped on chat and suggested the things they carried, which I've often heard redeployment compared to in certain ways, generation following generation. So.
Yeah. I didn't mention it because it's like it's like I figured it was already on your radar, but
we have a lot of books.
Wonderful book.
You never know about.
And they're great, short stories by Hemingway. Night Before Battle is one of my favorites. There's a lot of great stuff out there. So
awesome.
And I would say, give them some stuff that's not by vets, right? Give them some stuff by civilians. Give them The Ether of Space by Andrea Barrett, right? It's about a science writer going to see a physicist, a real guy, actually, historical figure, who is advancing a sort of BS theory, a once great physicist advancing a BS theory in the wake of Einstein, right? Arguing against Einstein. It becomes clear to her that the reason he's doing this is essentially because his son died in World War I. And it's related to what he's doing. It's a wonderful, really painful story by a beautiful writer. Read some of, actually, Frankenstein in Baghdad. I don't know what high school students would make of that. Or maybe Hassan Blasian, The Corks Exhibition. There are a couple of short stories in there that might be interesting to give high school students.
Well, I'll tell you, we're also getting a bunch on the chat. So thank you for everybody who's submitting those. I'll read one just because I think she actually may be on the call. Was Jennifer suggested Plenty of Time When We Get Home by Kayla Williams. And I think Kayla may be here with us. She's on the Advisory Council and is an amazing writer. We'll put these all together. We'll put this list that everybody has submitted together, and Phil, if you have more thoughts, just email them to me, and when we follow up, we'll send that list of reading for high school or beyond. Please, keep reading all of this stuff. But for now, Phil Klay, it's truly been a pleasure and an honor speaking with you today. Thanks for your time and for a great conversation. Best of luck with everything that comes with the launch of this new book. And I'm really looking forward for the next time that we can cross paths.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Phil. I'd now like to welcome our panelists. And we're going to move from literature back into a deep conversation on military fetishism. These are three individuals with whom I have an immense amount of respect, and I want to give them all as much time as possible to share their collective wisdom. So before I do, I'll just quickly introduce each one. Justin McFarland is a service-disabled veteran of the war in Iraq and a former U.S. Army officer with almost 15 years of aerospace and defense experience. Since leaving active duty, he's advised senior leaders in both the public and private sector on a wide range of national security issues, most recently as the director of corporate strategy at a large aerospace and defense organization. Justin holds a Bachelor's of Science from the United States Military Academy, an MBA from Dartmouth College, which I should note is also Phil's alma mater, and an MPA from Harvard University. He's a fellow at the Truman National Security Project and a founding member of our Everytown Veteran Advisory Council. More importantly, recently Justin published an op-ed in USA Today talking about the racial disparities surrounding carrying a firearm in public and the idea that open carry is a white privilege. Thanks for joining us, Justin. Katrina Mulligan is the Managing Director for National Security and International Policy at the Center for American Progress, where she supports the team's work on global security. Previously, she served as an attorney advisor and director for preparedness and response in the National Security Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. And before that, she worked on the National Security Council staff. Katrina received her bachelor's in Law, Letters, and Society from the University of Chicago, and her Juris Doctor from the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law. At present, Katrina and the CAP team are developing a detailed policy blueprint for countering violent white supremacy that identifies concrete policy actions that presidential candidates and Congress can take to make immediate progress in countering this threat. Welcome, Katrina. And last but not least, Lieutenant Colonel Jason Dempsey is a retired U.S. Army officer and veteran of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He's the founder of the E Pluribus Unum Foundation, an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security, and a senior advisor to the Columbia University Center for Veteran Transition and Integration. Jason's an expert on counterinsurgency efforts in Afghanistan and has written extensively on Army efforts toward gender and racial integration. On active duty, he led troops in combat, served as a special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and earned a White House fellowship in the Office of the First Lady. Dr. Dempsey is a graduate of the United States Military Academy. He holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University, and he's also a founding member of the Everytown Veteran Advisory Council. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Jason. Jason, I'd like to start with you. Much of your writing touches on the civilian-military divide. We live in an era of perpetual war, right? Having just passed the 19-year anniversary of the beginning of the war in Afghanistan. Yet, as Phil and I discussed, a very small proportion of Americans, only about maybe 6 million or so, have served in the post 9/11 era. Nonetheless, the military remains a revered institution. So how does the gap between civilian and military life, along with the ongoing conflicts overseas, play into what we see at home with regard to military fetishism, militias, and an armed society in general?
So for one, thanks for hosting. It's always wonderful to hear from Phil. And I think it's appropriate, right, that we stopped on this reading list and how do Americans conceptualize service? How do we understand warfare and what the American military does? And again, we stopped on a reading list, but we have to be clear that most Americans, one, haven't read those books. They're not interested in them. And not only are they not interested in, literature, for all intents and purposes, the understanding that most Americans have either is at the level of a movie or a comic book. And I would even go further and say that the best way you can characterize the typical American's relationship with the military, it's very much akin to a teenage boy's relationship with pornography, in that this view of the military doesn't have really anything to do with reality. It doesn't have to do anything with the reality of warfare or its complexity, but it's more this transactional, idealized fantasy, right? It's always got a happy ending, and it's completely at odds with the complexity of human relationships, and it presents a completely false picture about the efficacy of violence in solving complex problems. And so I think, two of the great things, Phil mentioned is, this ability that we should have learned the limits of violence from these wars, but we didn't. And that, we should have realized that, violence is no alternative to the hard work of politics. And a lot of that comes because we've had a very selective look at what the military has done over the last 19 years. And we are obviously in a very unique situation. Right? The military, as every other institution in America, has collapsed. By collapsed, I mean every institution in America, public confidence in that institution has utterly collapsed, with the exception of the military. So the military is the only thing left standing. And so everybody has projected their hopes and fears about the future onto the military. And, this really started, and again, I think it's a much longer conversation, and I can't wait to read Phil's book, because I'm sure he gets into this interplay of how you solve foreign problems and how that gets into how you solve all problems, really. But even our elites looked at the military over the course of these wars and said, well, shit, it's reshaping a country that's never been conquered, never been controlled. Nobody on earth has ever been able to do it. But this guy in uniform appears to be competent. Let's send him or her off to go give it a shot. So if our elites kind of fell for this idea, this idealized vision of massive military capability, then we really shouldn't be surprised at the idea that there are 17-year-old boys and young men and even ex-service members who have fallen into this idea that, hey, the military is uniquely powerful. And if only we simplify our problems such that it's an us versus them, and it's an existential threat, well, we can solve it with guns. There's just so much, of course, to unpack here. It's easy to be virtuous when you see the world in absolute a black and white narrative. And of course, that's the way many of our leaders view our wars overseas, right? We're just going to bomb the shit out of them and somehow we'll win. Or, all Muslims are evil. Those simplifications make us feel good, but of course, they don't lead to anything. So that's a really long way to say the fundamental disconnect between America and its military, combined with the fact that the military is now the only trusted institution, has led both elites and regular folks to think, okay, I'm either going to rely on the military to solve all our problems overseas, or I'm going to emulate what the military does. I'm going to try on this costume literally because the world around me is so goddamn complex and I'm so confused. But by God, if I carry a gun and I go to Kenosha, I can feel like I'm making a difference. So there's a lot more in there, and we haven't even addressed, but I'm sure we will. The racial element can't be ignored, but with that, let me just I'll stop there.
We're going to try. We're going to try to get as much of it as possible, and we will get into some of that for sure. I think that thinking about the military emulation is how those of us who conceived of this particular forum in this session, that's what we saw, right? We saw the military fetishism and the cosplay and emulating military in amongst civilians and militias. But for Katrina and for you all at the Center for American Progress, you were all actually inspired to look at violent extremism in America after the mass shooting in a mosque in Christchurch in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So you see these issues through a global lens at CAP, whether it be the idea that the United States is actually exporting ideas of hate and violence and white supremacy to other parts of the world, or the fact that even the Trump administration's Department of Homeland Security has highlighted the extreme risk posed to Americans by domestic terrorism. Based on your background and the scope of the project that you're leading, what are we missing when we fail to see the larger implications of the trends toward violent extremism?
I think you're exactly right to tie what's happening domestically to what's happening abroad. And that, as everybody on this call knows, has important consequences for what we do about it. So I think first we can't view domestic terrorism or violent white supremacy through an exclusively domestic lens without missing a really big part of what is underpinning all of what are. It's true, just to draw on what Jason was saying earlier, an awful lot of Americans love the symbols and iconography of our war, whether it's military flyovers at sporting events or military-themed video games or movies, country songs, parades. War has become a part of our sort of cultural diet and the way that we celebrate things. It's a part of our good times and our bad. But that mindset requires there to be an enemy. And as we are drawing down some of our fighting overseas, it isn't surprising, even if it is concerning, that we're starting to find enemies at home. We see it in the vilification of immigrants. We see it in the rise of white nationalism, the chance of not replace us in Charlottesville. Our current domestic situation has roots in our foreign conflict, and we have to understand the connection between the two before we really start to address it. Second, I think there are some really dark and scary transnational links between the white supremacist groups here in the United States and abroad. And those groups are beginning to provide funding and training to each other and do a lot of things that really start to feel very familiar and bear a greater resemblance to what we saw in command and control structure of the terrorism network. And I think that's increasingly concerning those of us who are seeing sort of the transnational with this problem. The thing that's also problematic is that these extremist groups at home and abroad are beginning to imitate the tactics, techniques, and procedures of groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS, who themselves gained a lot from the way that our military sharing approaches to recruitment, financing, propaganda, but also just like the outfit, the clothes that they're wearing and the way that they're approaching, the way they're operating within their society. There's an authority element that comes along with all of this that is really baked in. Third, white supremacy is not a new thing. I think we talk a lot about the rise of white supremacy, or the rise, that there's been this change. And I think it's really important to be clear about what we're talking about, because it's not the case that white supremacy is a phenomenon. It's been in our country since our country's founding and even before then. But what is new is the rapid expansion of social media, which is facilitating radicalization, recruitment, and mobilization. And what's interesting and is part of what CAP is studying is the extent to which we actually know a lot about what moves people on the pathway to becoming radicalized, and what types of what types of sort of statements by leaders, and what types of virtue signaling go on that actually move people along that pathway. But it is also the case that with our domestic problems, that the civil rights and civil liberties of U.S. persons protect a lot of the things that we think are concerning, and rightly so. And so what it means is that while we have a lot of counterterrorism tools and capabilities that could learn a lot from as we confront this new problem set, there are actually a lot of those tools that we can't and shouldn't use at home. And that, I think, makes the problem uniquely challenging for the government to figure out, civil society to figure out it. Finally, and this is kind of my last point, and I'll throw it back to you. I know we're going to talk a lot more about the role of the police later, and that's another area that I think is really important to touch on. But I think that America needs to contend with the fact that we have become exporters of hate and violence, and they're not just the victims of it anymore. As we think about a lot of the ideas that originated here, and the way that those ideas are showing up in violent manifestos and that sort of thing, we're seeing our leaders and our, and some of the people that maybe we don't view as our most favorable exports, David Duke, Candace Owens, other American personalities that are being listed as inspiration for violent acts, and for the cultivation of these worldviews. And I think a lot of these personalities have really large international followings and are becoming symbols in a way that I don't think they may even intend. And so, when I think back to the counterterrorism fight, and I was involved National Counterterrorism Center during the Benghazi in Boston, we used to put a lot of pressure on other countries to clean up their act at home and to get a handle on their local kind of militias and things like that. And now I think the tables are turned, and we are going to have to clean our act at home as a key pillar of our strategy and responding to this threat. And so anyway, I'll pause there. We can dive in on the law enforcement side too in a little bit.
Yeah, no, I relate to that really, really clearly. Being in Afghanistan in 2004, and the idea that, like, we were, you could still see like the monkey bars that the where they were training, and you saw those videos, grainy videos back in the day, and you could still see those sites. And we thought, why would Afghanistan allow these violent, militias to train and to apply this craft here, and then you can see it, whether it's in real life or over social media, that the United States is potentially doing something similar, in allowing that to happen. But I want to key more on what Katrina said about civil rights and civil liberties, and the way that those apply sort of asymmetrically in this conversation. And go to Justin, who again wrote that great op-ed in USA Today about open carry being white privilege. I've heard you, Justin, speak many times on what it's like to be a Black gun owner in the United States, and how race plays a huge role in how the law is applied to you and to other Black men in particular. We know that some of the extremist groups who emulate the military want to incite a race war, while there's others who march alongside Black Lives Matter protesters. The common factor for all these groups, or across all these groups, of course, is that they're all heavily armed. So I'm curious, when you see that hodgepodge of messages and motivations out there, combined with, the omnipresence of firepower, what are you hearing, and how does it resonate with you as a veteran, as a Black man, and as a gun owner?
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me on the panel. I guess first things to be clear, while yes, there have been armed guards at Black Lives Matter protests to counter intimidation techniques that we've seen by some of the far right counter protesters. And it's not a regular occurrence, and I think despite centuries of violence perpetuated against persons of color in our country, we've seen very peaceful protests. And no one's really advocating to take up arms against America or our fellow citizens like we're seeing on the right. But to answer your question, I think there's three perspectives that you laid out, and viewing this through all three of those lenses is very concerning. As a veteran, I think we've talked a lot about fetishism and the role that plays. And I think from a practical matter, because I'm a very practical kind of guy, just from a practical matter, it's just confusing when you see militia members and others wearing military style camouflage, military surplus uniforms and equipment on the streets. You don't know who's what and who's doing what to who, when there are protests and counter protests, and if there are altercations, and that's concerning. Because it also looks bad upon sort of myself and the others that served in uniform to see others that are wearing similar type of uniforms perpetuating acts of violence against their own citizens or other citizens. I think that the second lens that I'm looking at this through is that of a gun owner, as you mentioned. And it's deeply concerning because I think one of the things that responsible gun owners try to fight is the perception of that we're crazy, that we're all crazies, that we're all just running around with ARs to go grocery shopping, and that's really not truly the case. I think the majority of gun owners are responsible and try to live by a lot of the things that we talk about on the VAC, training, safety, and accountability. But then you have, folks like the militia members and then others on the far right and the extremists who kind of make the rest of us look bad in some ways as gun owners. But then the one thing that I think, really stands out to me, and that's the last one that you laid out, is how I see this as a Black man. And I think this is where I'm most concerned. Because as I look at, both the sort of the anti-government movement, the militia movement, white supremacy is a key theme. I think we've mentioned, a couple times throughout these conversations, but it's a key theme that you see either overtly or covertly within a lot of these groups. And I think also, the recent protests and counter protests have shined a spotlight on, what you're pointing to, which is some of the ways that laws are unequally enforced within our country. Even laws around the Second Amendment. As I wrote in the op-ed, open carry is quite legal in many states, even when protesting, and in many places even around state legislature. However, you know, the last time, well, not the last time, because they did it, more recently, but, a lot of guns violence prevention and what we call gun control laws were put into place to prevent Black protesters from doing that same thing. Um, you can point to a number of Second Amendment advocates in recent years who have recorded themselves and others, people of color, walking on the streets, exercising their Second Amendment rights and open carrying, and harassed by police and stopped and accosted. But what we're seeing now is sort of a wanton, gratuitous allowance of militia members and armed groups to uh, just kind of have their way with these protests during the protests and counter protests, and it's not as a gun owner, again, it's just not safe when you're protesting. You're not necessarily, it's an emotional time. Tensions are very high. That's not an environment where you want to bring firearms. And also, to me, kind of defeats the purpose of having a civil conversation when one side is trying to bring firearms or weapons to have a discourse. So I think there's a lot of different elements in there, a lot of things that I've seen and experienced when it comes to disparities in treatment for Black gun owners. And I think that is something that we need to address in some way when it comes to specifically open carry and closing that loophole and passing laws in certain states to close that loophole because it's not equally enforced amongst the citizens.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point that people are intimidating. They are being intimidating towards others while holding these firearms. That's the point, right? That's exactly why they're doing it. And they're being allowed to do it because of the lack of open carry laws. And most states actually just don't have, there wasn't a problem before, and they haven't actually defined and legislated on open carry the same way they have on concealed carry, because they thought, the concealed carry was more of a priority or whatnot. Hopefully we'll see change there. I think a lot of when we think about protests, we're also thinking about the way that law enforcement interacts. And Katrina mentioned this earlier, that the police have a major role here. Some of the extremist groups that we're discussing are actively targeting police and other law enforcement, as especially the ones who are anti-government, right? On the other hand, as we saw in Kenosha, some law enforcement believe that these militias and other armed groups are on their side. So Katrina, can you speak briefly about the role of law enforcement in combating and accommodating military fetishism?
Sure. So police in America, when we think back, to ye olden times, police in America were peace officers. They were not what we think of today when we think of kind of the warrior cops that you see on the streets or in the news, who have traded kind of that traditional blue uniform for more of like a battle uniform that is modeled really after soldier attire. This is not a good development for police. It's not good for the military. It's not good for the people they serve. And I think it's worth stepping back to think about how we got here. As is often the case, and this is really no different. Something really well intentioned has gotten out of hand here, and what that was is these DoD programs that kind of grew out of the post counterterrorism era, known as the 1033 program and the 1122 program. They were initially intended to support state and local governments by providing them with excess military equipment that could be used in policing and in counterterrorism. They were trying to really make sure that local law enforcement, state and local, were prepared in certain areas for the kinds of counterterrorism threats that they were facing. And those were really valid, concerns, and it made a lot of sense what they were trying to do. What has happened now is that there's become like almost an insatiable demand for providing local police departments with military grade equipment and training that really surpasses what you may need in places that really are not hotbeds for terrorist activity, but where you now have state and local police forces, walking around fully decked out like they could be on the streets Afghanistan. And, you know, that is at odds with, I think, a really important fundamental legal tradition in this country, the tradition of prohibiting the military from enforcing domestic law. And that is, you know, when you think about Patti Comitatus and some of these sort of bedrock principles that we don't use our military for domestic law enforcement purposes, it's one of the things actually that sets us apart as a democracy. And it's really important to sort of who we are and our democratic values. But now those lines are getting blurred. We're not only arming our police and making them look like soldiers, we're sending actual soldiers to do jobs that are actually domestic police jobs and homeland security functions, whether that's at the border and southwest border, or whether it's, you know, at Guantanamo Bay, where we are asking and have been for, you know, the last 15 years, 20 years, almost 20 years now, we've been asking soldiers to become prison guards, to take on roles that are not really what they, you know, signed up to do. And that has consequences. Those lines used to be black and white. And now they're not as black and white anymore, which is not great. And so the net effect of everything I just described is we're changing what community policing is. Fundamentally, we're outfitting our police departments as if they're going to war, and they no longer see their role as serving, but instead as opposing and occupying. And you saw that in really stark relief in the George Floyd protest. And then in Oregon, where we actually, you know, we saw all these viral videos and photos of police, you know, really treating the protesters as though they were enemy combatants in some ways, using tear gas, flashbang. We saw undercover DHS officials, federal law enforcement officials, pull people into unmarked cars. And here's the thing that I keep thinking about. That method of policing, that attempt to sort of take what our military does and make it domestic and try to operationalize it here, it's not working. The public isn't happy with it. The police departments aren't happy with it. You got all these calls to defund the police. You got abolish ICE. And they feel like they're not being supported by the people that they're trying to you know, work for and serve. And the actual soldiers who are fighting our wars, many of the people on this call, I imagine many of you aren't happy about it either, because it's creating this negative association in people's minds with a thing that, you know, is not, it's not what you guys, it's not a good reflection on our military for all the reasons that we've already discussed about the way that, you know, the military does things differently and with more accountability and responsibility, and they're responsible to other people. So I think the role that police are playing in perpetuating this, and I didn't even touch on, you know, the ways in which state and local police are actually in many, you know, localities, you know, in cahoots with some of these militias. It's a dangerous road that we're on, and we really need to reverse course.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there.
Well, no, I think you hit on a couple great points, and one is, you know, when we were preparing for this and I was having some conversations with folks, someone pointed out that a lot of these militias that we're talking about are really well trained, and some of the reasons they're well trained is because they're recruiting from military and veteran populations and from law enforcement populations. I pointed out that's fine. They can be well trained. They can be a good shot. They can spend time at the range. But we talk about training, safety, and accountability. Again, accountability being a really crucial one for, you know, when you're in the military, you're accountable to not only your fellow service members, your commanders, and the American people, quite frankly. And those militias are not. They're only accountable to themselves. But it's not an accident that they recruit from police and from veteran populations. And Jason, I want to ask you, you know, you've studied inclusion and othering in the U.S. military. And look, not everybody in a militia or folks who are engaging in military cosplay is a white male, but let's just say that white males are vastly overrepresented in most of these groups. Meanwhile, of course, the military itself is relatively diverse along racial lines. So what's different about militias that makes them so attractive to white males?
There we go. All right. I was trying to signal unmute. Well, I think, and this gets very contentious, I think, because we're okay with military force versus the foreign other. And we in the military, we've all been exposed to grappling with how do you deal with foreign cultures. And the easiest way to convince somebody to kill, obviously, is to turn that foreigner into somebody who's less than human, to dehumanize, right? They're the evil enemy, and you see it in, this poster behind me is actually one of the more tame ones from World War I, because it doesn't portray, the Hun as a rapist and a pillager, but typically that's what we do. Now we've tried to move away from that in these modern wars, understanding we need to get the population together. But it's still a large part of how we in the military, we work against it, but also how many Americans kind of approach armed conflict, right? We're beating back the hordes. And so we have to say, well, what is it about what militias do in America? And they're, in the book, I think Ballou that somebody mentioned earlier, in a recent article, about the honored dead, tracing basically the way the NRA and their magazine, the way they talked about people defending their home in the form of sacrifice narratives, right? This idea that they were fighting somebody. And I can guarantee you, right, even though most violence, most theft, most rapes, most assaults are people right? That's not the story that the NRA would write about, right? It's the crime you're defending. You don't get a gun necessarily to defend your home against your drug-addled cousin who's coming across to steal your Percocet. You buy a gun because you envision a horde of others, right, assaulting you in your way of life. And to be very frank about it, Black Americans are the other in America. And so it's interesting to see when militias evolve and when they have oxygen, it's almost always explicitly in reaction to Black America. And if you look at a great piece by Jennifer Steinauer in the New York Times, the one that talks about her, the recruitment of veterans into militias, a couple interesting quotes. It talks about how they traditionally saw themselves as anti-government, right? But then, of course, beginning in 2009, antagonism towards Barack Obama, combined with a new crop of veterans from these foreign wars, we saw exponential growth, right? And so while you see folks like the Oath Keepers forming, right, to encourage folks to honor their oath against tyranny, all of a sudden, Antifa and Black Lives Matter are the threat. And so it's this flip from, well, we kind of hate the federal government, but actually, no, we don't hate the federal government, not as much as we hate minorities and how much we want to otherize them. So it's really about who do we tolerate? And, we can argue about, oh, gee, is everybody driven by racism? But I think we all have to ask ourselves, right? Who do we tolerate? As Justin points out, we do not tolerate a Black man carrying a gun in a protest. He would be picked out quickly by police and moved away, let alone armed squads of Black men walking down city streets. Think about, again, the Kenosha thing, right? If a Black man entered into a protest carrying a weapon, shot a bunch of people, even if it was in self-defense, is there any universe, any plausible universe where that man would be allowed to walk away and walk through a line of police officers while still carrying his weapon? Right? And now, of course, there is a political movement in the United States that celebrates that kid. And it violates, of course, everything that we talk about, training, safety, accountability, right? There is no problem on earth to which handing a 17-year-old boy a weapon is the right answer. But for a lot of Americans, it's okay to give a 17-year-old boy a weapon when we're talking about keeping the other in check. And so I don't think it's too much of a hyperbole to say that a lot of this tie-in is it's not just about the foreign other, it's about the domestic other. And it's about maintaining, which frankly is a system that's frankly an all but officially sanctioned apartheid system.
That's a powerful answer, Jason. I want to kick it to Justin to talk about the concept of an apartheid system. I am apologize for everybody to everybody that we're out of time. And so I'm going to have to wrap this session, but it's a conversation that I want to keep going, certainly within our VAC and within the group of people that we have here. For now, I would like to offer my sincere thanks to Phil Klay for joining us. His new book is called Missionaries, and you should go find it wherever you buy books. And if you haven't read Redeployment, you should read that as well. I'd like to thank our panel members, Katrina Mulligan, Justin McFarland, and Dr. Jason Dempsey, for their perspective and knowledge on this topic. It's been eye-opening to say the least, and clearly we're not done with the conversation. This is the final session of Veterans for Gun Sense that we planned for the 2020 election season, but we do hope to reconvene this group periodically around topical issues that impact veterans and gun violence prevention, of which there are many. We may even have to do it again on this topic because there's so much left unsaid. So stay tuned for more information on our next session. Thanks to Mara and the Everytown staff for behind the scenes assistance with the forum. Thanks to the members of the Everytown Veteran Advisory Council for supporting this effort. And I hope to speak with all of you again soon. Good night.